Hello and welcome back to the Basic Bible Podcast. I'm your host, Kevin Thompson, and today I am really excited about this episode, this particular podcast, because we're talking about a subject that's near and dear to my heart, adoption. We are living right now in an age I never thought I'd live to see. That's the post-Roe v. Wade era. And I'm still thrilled that our country is taking this direction. But now that we've taken this direction, the fight over abortion is not over, but it's really just begun. Instead of a national level fight, it is a state by state and really family by family fight. And so now taking center stage is not just abortion, but the issue of adoption, because the common refrain from those on the pro-choice side will say, okay, well, if we're going to have all of these forced births, then you better step up and start adopting people. And the problem is that, well, kids aren't getting adopted. They're wasting away in foster care. And there's a lot of misconceptions about adoption. And that's why we have on the podcast today John Knox, who's the founder of the Institute. John, really, thank you so much for coming on the podcast today.
Thank you, Kevin. I really appreciate being here.
And so, the issue of listeners know that this is an issue I'm very passionate about. My wife and I have adopted 4 children. And what really I try to be tolerant as much as I can. I try to be understanding that people have different views, whether political or in matters of faith. But the perception I'm getting from my pro-choice friends are that, children are better off being aborted than adopted. And that there's very few things that make me more upset than the idea that kids should be killed instead of being put up for adoption. I think a lot of that is because we really don't understand what adoption is all about. And the Institute and Adoption is an Option is doing great work in that field. I'd like to start off by, can you kind of give us your personal story, why you jumped into this fray and why the Institute even exists?
Kevin, I spent 40 years in the surety bond business. I was building and selling insurance companies and doing that. And after I'd sold my first fairly large company in the 90s, I ended up during a non-compete period going out and doing a search to find my birth mother. I was adopted in 1955 and it was a closed adoption in Colorado and very difficult to find. But I went back and did a search and I found my birth mother in California and my birth father in New York, and had 25 years or so with each of them that I enjoyed getting to know them. My birth mother did not want her husband and 5 children to know about me. And so it was all shrouded in secret, which is the way adoption used to be. Yeah. And so she wanted me to tell her kids after she died. So it wasn't until 2017 that I ended up telling her 5 children that I existed after she was gone. So that's kind of where it came. And when I sold my last company, I knew from non-compete periods that I wasn't very good at unemployment. and I had to figure out what I was going to do. And God filled me up to go do something in the adoption world. And so that's where I ended up forming Adoption as an Option and going forward with that and seeing if I could take my time, talent, and treasure from the business community and use that in the nonprofit world, and was just amazed to learn that adoption had all but died on private adoption the way I was adopted. I mean, back when I was adopted in the 50s, there were hundreds of thousands of kids that were adopted. Last year, our research showed that there were less than 20,000 children place for private adoption in the United States last year.
So why do you think that is? Why is that number been decreasing?
I think a big part of it is there's a confusion on adoption with the foster care system, which and private adoption. And I'm talking with a lot of people about using the name open adoption as opposed to private infant adoption. Private sounds like it's closeted and closed and something of that nature. Open adoption today, which is how adoption really works today, is the birth mother has all the choices. She gets to pick the family. One of the things we learned in the Barna research was that 30 million women in America don't realize they get to pick the birth family.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a huge core element. They can have their own lawyer, they can have their own counselor, they can have their own people to help them. And that's where I think we think of it as open adoption today, and referring to it as open. It doesn't necessarily mean that she has to have an open relationship with the birth family that's adopting. It may be that she's open to that child coming back 20 years or 40 years later, like I did, in terms of having that. But an open relationship with God, an open relationship with that child to give life.
Yeah, and that's really important because I don't think people understand, at least in this current debate, it seems like adoption only means foster care. And I'm all for adopting out of foster care. I think it's a great ministry. I think Christians, evangelicals ought to consider that. But for a young woman, maybe unwed or financially struggling, whatever, foster care is when the state comes in and has to take a child from a home. But a woman who finds herself in a position where she cannot take care of a child, where for whatever reason she doesn't feel like she can raise this child on her own, the option isn't just foster care, but as you mentioned, an open adoption where women have options. And talk to us a little bit more about those options, because you're hitting on something really important that people aren't getting, is that this isn't the way it was in the 1950s. Let's talk about some of those changes and just what the options women have really are.
The options they have today, it's totally different. And that's where when we see a lot of the articles coming out lately being against adoption and talking about the way that it used to be, it's not how it is today. Today, a woman is completely empowered. She has the choice to be able to pick the family. She has the choice to have her own lawyer. She has the choice to make the decision on what type of communication she wants to have going forward. She gets to have those conversations. And if she's working with one of the top or the licensed better adoption agencies and lawyers, they can help her through that whole process to where she's in control. Where their confusion comes is the foster care side, just like what you said. They think of it as being like foster care because there's so many more kids that are adopted through the foster care system, right? Because that's where the state has taken control. They've terminated the birth parents' rights. They've taken control and they're making all the decisions. What's wonderful about it on the private side or on the open side is to have her be able to make those decisions, have her to be able to pick those. You talked about the number of people. I mean, there's at least 700,000 families that want to adopt. The agencies around the country are telling us that it's a 40-to-1 ratio of how many families they have that want to adopt versus how many children are available at birth. Most people want to adopt one at birth. I love the foster care system, but it's harder to adopt after a child has spent the number of years and the number of times it takes going through the foster care system. And so that's where if more birth mothers would choose adoption, if they would choose open adoption at the beginning, we would end up with a lot less kids in the foster care system.
Yeah. So again, it's not merely you have to either have your child or put them up in foster care. There are other options, and that's really why you launched this study, Abortion and Its Competitors, Results of a National Survey Regarding Adoption in the U.S. in 2022. This is put out by George Barna, but your institute here commissioned that study. And the shocking result is that not only do women not have the correct information, but it seems so they don't have the people to point them in the right direction, it seems.
They don't, and I think they have trouble finding those. There's some great resources available to women today. That there's an organization in Dallas called Brave Love. It's bravelove.org that has lots of vetted partners on their site that they have that they can refer people to. They have great stories on their site about birth mothers. They don't try to make it easy. They don't try to sugarcoat it. It's not an easy option. And they make it clear. I mean, if you have an unwanted or unintended pregnancy, you've got 3 really hard options in terms of that. But they tell the real stories, and they tell the stories about these loving women who are brave and go forward and with adoption, and how rewarding it is to them in terms of what they do. One of the things in there is they're also able to connect women with those local agencies. They have them broken down by state. The National Council for Adoption also has on their site broken down by state, where you can find local licensed agencies and attorneys that can help.
And if you're here in this area where I'm at, again, I constantly promote the Willow Women's Center. Does a great job in giving you resources and pointing you in the right direction. There are many areas or many organizations that are willing to do that. Reading through this survey, the thing that shocked me the most is how little influence the church has in all of this. It seems as though women are not comfortable at all talking to their pastors, talking to their church leaders about this topic. Was that a surprise to you?
It was a huge surprise. The churches came in at 12%. There were a number of surprises there. I would have thought peers and the internet and those would influence women the most. Outside of family, the number one influencer of women were doctors in the medical community. Yeah. And then counselors and therapists were way up on the list. It seems that when somebody has a crisis in today's society, they look to the experts, right? They look to people on the outside, and that's what they do. I mean, Planned Parenthood even ranked higher than the church. Yeah. In terms of where women are turning for advice. It's very surprising.
So what can we do to change that within our, even it was broken down here, even women who claim the name of Christ, who claim to be Christians, still aren't turning to their churches. So what can we do in our churches to start to reverse that?
The church needs to be willing to talk about it. A lot of the churches don't want to talk about abortion because their parishioners are split in terms of their feelings of that. But I do not understand why the churches are not willing to talk about adoption. I mean, Moses gave us the greatest open adoption story in history right at the beginning, right? I mean, he's got the story of open adoption, and for the church, it seems to me to be a wonderful opportunity to be able to talk about that. Over the last 50 years that we've lived under under the Roe v. Wade decision. Adoption has just gotten lost. It's kind of been forced out of the dialogue. Today, when somebody finds out they're pregnant with an unwanted, unintended pregnancy, they think about abortion or I'm going to have this kid. I mean, those are the only two choices they think about. They're not thinking about adoption. And I think the church can play a huge role by talking biblically about how you can get adopted twice. We're adopted into God's family, but adoption is a wonderful message, and it's a wonderful way to live. Those of us who have been adopted, that's what we did with the I Am That Kid series that's on our site. But those of us that have been adopted want to share those stories. We've done 10 new stories that'll go on that site in the next 6 weeks or so. But it's a message we need to get out there. It's a message I think the church needs to tell. I mean, I think there's a reason God wanted us to know so early on in the Bible about what a wonderful option that adoption is.
So I can hear some objections from my fellow church members say, "Whoa, wait a minute. We still need to preach against sin, right? Because sex before marriage, we believe, is a sin, and therefore, if there's a young mother in a church, we don't want to praise that. We don't want to somehow highlight that."
You don't want to highlight it, but we all don't live a perfect life, and we live in a society to say we don't even want to talk about it. I mean, there was a story about a preacher that I knew of for 30 years. He was preaching against abortion, and all of a sudden, his 16-year-old daughter got pregnant. And he ended up taking her to another state to get an abortion. And I think about what a tragedy that is, not just for the child, but thinking about the tragedy for her that grew up in that family and for him to go against his basic belief.
Right.
And I said, why not adoption? And the answer was, I didn't even think about adoption.
Yeah.
I mean, I didn't even know how to respond on that. You know, that's what's wrong, is that nobody's thinking about adoption. Even in the Barna study of the ones that were born again Christians, that in his study, 10% of them thought that adoption was not biblically correct. I mean, they thought there was something wrong with it from that aspect. I mean, this is the exact opposite. We've got a book that's telling us what a wonderful story adoption is.
I mean, the essence of the gospel, the essence of a Christian worldview is that idea of redemption, where we take something that was a bad situation and God redeems that for his glory and for his honor. I mean, that's the whole Christian life, is the idea of grace and forgiveness to those who are undeserving. And that we can, I'll tell you just a quick story. I'm sorry if I'm not going to bore you with this, but in our church, a few years ago, we had a family come in, and little did we know that the young teenage girl was pregnant. She had just found out shortly before they came, and they took the pastor aside and they said, "Well, we got to tell you about this. If we're going to join the church, if we're going to be a part of this congregation, you should probably know." And to make a long story short, that child, or that mother, said, "You know what? They met a couple in the church who were trying to adopt, and they had several failed adoptions, and it was a big mess. But she said, I feel like God wants me to give this child to this family." And I'll tell you, it was the most emotional, joyful church service I've ever been in my life when that announcement was made. We didn't glorify the sin, but God used that situation to bless another family, and not just another family, but the entire congregation, as it was just a remarkable, remarkable expression of joy and love and grace and blessing, because that young woman had the courage to give her child up in an open adoption. And they still continue to have a relationship today. But I'll tell you that the joy that it brought that church, I can't imagine a church not wanting that. And we could repeat that story over and over again if it goes back to the gospel. It goes back to redemption. It goes back to grace and forgiveness, and how God can change that situation and bring it to his honor and to his glory. And I'm sure, John, you could probably tell other stories very similar.
Those are the types of stories that we need to tell, Kevin. I mean, that is what it's intended to be. We saw that recently over in Kerrville come together with a 16-year-old and a volleyball player with her quarterback boyfriend that got pregnant, and it was a small town over in the Texas Hill Country, and the whole town kind of came together and supported those two people as they walked through having a child and placing it for adoption, and they honored them in such ways that I think that town all sees that. And we just need more of that across America. We need to see more of those stories and see the redemption that comes from that.
Yeah. Well, we are out of time. And John, I really want to thank you for your ministry and for the work that you do. It's important. It is gospel-centered, and we certainly need more of it. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I appreciate it. And
I want to thank all of you listeners for tuning in here or downloading this. Again, our recommended resources this week: Adoption and Its Competitors. This George Barna study, we'll have a link to that. We also want to have a link to the Opt Institute and Adoption is an Option. Go through these YouTube videos that we were just mentioning. I Am That Kid. I was listening to several of those this morning. It'll fill your heart. It will bring joy. And thank you again, John. All right, so tune in next week. And until then, have a great rest of your. Don't forget our website, www.basicbiblepodcast.org. You'll find all those links right there. So we'll come back next week.